I was standing in the wrong place at the right time. That's the only way I know how to describe it. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't supposed to see any of it. I had a transit pass, a carry bag with 2 changes of clothes, and a meal voucher that was already expired by 2 standard days. I was supposed to be on the connector shuttle to the Vale Station freight port, looking for work as a cargo manifest checker. That was the plan. My plan. The simple, boring, nothing special plan of a man who had run out of better options. Instead, I ended up watching a human man nearly die for a princess. And I watched a princess nearly die, proving everyone wrong. Let me start from the beginning. Not the dramatic beginning, not the throne room, not the blood, not the moment the whole galaxy stopped breathing. Let me start from where I was standing, because that's the only honest way I know how to tell this. The Velkari homeworld is called Solveth Prime by the translation networks, but the Velkari themselves call it something that sounds like 3 syllables of wind moving through tall grass, Vesolith, which roughly translates to the world that breathes. I had heard about it for years. Everyone in the Outer Rim had. The Velkari were old. They were powerful. They were beautiful in a way that made humans feel like they were standing next to architecture, like the Velkari weren't so much people as they were geography. They stood somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall, most of them. Their skin had this deep bioluminescent quality, not glowing, not exactly, more like the way certain deep ocean creatures carry light just beneath the surface. Under artificial station lighting, it barely showed, but under the twin suns of Solveth Prime, they shimmered. Their eyes were large and set wide, irises that shifted color with emotional state, amber for calm, blue for focus, a deep violet for grief or love. Apparently those 2 states registered nearly identically in Velkari neurobiology, which I found oddly poetic. Their fingers were long, 3 on each hand plus an opposing thumb analog, and they moved with this fluid economy that made every gesture look intentional. They were also, as a civilization, among the most hierarchically rigid societies in the known galaxy. I mean that in the most exhaustive, institutional sense. The Velkari had not just a royal family but a royal caste system, and within that system was a secondary aristocratic lattice, and within that was a tertiary council structure, and all of it was governed by something called the Carvel, which translated roughly to the blood logic. A framework of succession law so old that most Velkari legal scholars spent entire careers just cataloging its subsections. The Carvel said, among many things, that royalty bonded with royalty. Or, at minimum, with other Velkari of verified genetic lineage. Humans, as you might guess, did not qualify. I arrived at Solveth Prime on a passenger hauler out of the Dreven corridor. 43 passengers, mostly Velkari returning home after business cycles on the outer stations, a handful of Kreth traders, 2 Marin diplomats who spent the entire 18-hour journey playing a tile game I didn't recognize, and me, the only human. The Velkari on the ship were polite to me in the way that people are polite to something they find mildly puzzling. Not unkind, just calibrated. They spoke in their own language most of the time, and when they addressed me, they switched to standard with the careful deliberateness of people who had learned it academically rather than lived it. They offered me food when the meal cycle came. One of them, a young one, I think, though Velkari age is hard for me to read, asked if I was comfortable with the atmospheric pressure settings. When I said yes, she nodded and went back to her seat. That was the extent of our interaction. When we landed, the transit terminal was enormous. Everything on Solveth Prime was enormous, built for Velkari scale, which meant I spent a lot of time feeling like a child in rooms designed for adults. The ceilings were cathedral high. The corridors were wide enough to drive ground vehicles through them. The signage was in Velkari script first, standard second, and I had to crane my neck back to read even the secondary text. I cleared customs. Human visitors weren't common, but they weren't forbidden. Solveth Prime had been part of the Galactic Compact for 60 standard years, and came out into the Central Transit Concourse. That's when I heard the crowd. Not a bad crowd, not a riot, more like a gathering that had achieved a kind of collective electricity. Thousands of Velkari packed into the upper observation galleries that ringed the concourse, all of them looking down at something on the main floor below. Their irises were shifting. I saw yellows, I saw blues, some were amber. A few, the ones at the very front of the galleries, leaning over the rails with particular intensity, had gone a complicated mixture of orange and gray that I didn't have a reference point for. I asked the nearest transit worker what was happening. She looked down at me with that patient, calibrated politeness I was coming to associate with this place. "The princess," she said, "she is arriving." "Which princess?" "The princess," she said, with an emphasis that communicated clearly that on Solveth Prime there was only one worth saying like that. "Princess Velyara, daughter of the sovereign, heir of the Carvel." I followed her gaze toward the main floor. And that was the first time I saw her. She walked in the way that people walk when they know they're being watched but have decided not to perform for it. Not stiff, not rigid, just present. Just moving through the space with the full weight of her attention turned inward rather than outward, which on a person who looked like her read as something between serenity and complete indifference. She was tall even for a Velkari, closer to 8 feet than 7. Her bioluminescence was deeper than most, a warm gold-green shimmer that was visible even under the artificial concourse lighting. Her irises were amber, perfectly, constantly amber. That, I would later learn, was remarkable. Velkari who had achieved a deep personal stillness could hold a single iris color for extended periods. It took practice. It took something close to mastery. She wore traveling clothes, nothing ceremonial, but they had a quality to them that I recognized even from my distance on the concourse floor. The kind of quality that comes from material so fine that it moves like it's part of the body. She had a small retinue, 6 guards in the formal armor of the royal house, black alloy plates over a matte dark underlayer, ceremonial blades at their sides, energy weapons in holsters that were conspicuously not decorative. 2 attendants, a court official with a data tablet who walked slightly ahead and slightly to her left. And 1 human. He was walking beside her, not behind, beside. He was around 30, I guessed. Medium height, absurdly, comically medium height compared to everyone around him. Brown hair cut close. A face that I'd describe as honest-looking, the kind where you can read every thought as it moves through. He wore a jacket in a dark color that I recognized as military cut, though with no active insignia, ex-military, then, or military adjacent. He moved with the specific, contained quality of someone who has trained their body to take up exactly as much space as it needs and no more. He was walking beside the princess. And they were talking. Not in the formal, translated way I'd been spoken to all morning, actually talking. She said something, and he turned his head toward her with the easy attention of someone who had been listening to this particular voice for a long time and found it worth listening to. He said something back. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a breath, and her irises shifted, just for a moment, from amber to something warm and gold. The crowd in the observation galleries noticed that too. The sound that came from them wasn't angry. Not exactly. It was complicated. It was the sound of a large group of people confronting something that violated an expectation they had held so long they'd stopped realizing they were holding it. His name, I learned later, was Marcus Reyes. Not a diplomat, not a political figure, not a scientist or a specialist or anyone who had been sent to Solveth Prime for any official reason. He was, by all external records, a former combat medic from the Earth Defense Initiative who had mustered out 3 years prior after the conflict in the Dren Belt and spent the intervening time doing humanitarian aid work on frontier medical ships. He'd met Velyara on one of those ships, the medical freighter Varenthes, a joint Velkari human humanitarian vessel operating in the outer Kreth corridor, had taken on a royal observer 2 standard years before any of this. The princess, by her own account filed later as part of the public record, had asked to be assigned to a humanitarian posting rather than a diplomatic one. She'd wanted, she said, to understand suffering at its base level, not suffering as a political concept but as a material reality. She'd wanted to know what it felt like to do the small, unglamorous work of keeping people alive. She got Marcus Reyes as her assigned medical partner. For 16 months, they worked the Creth corridor together, 14-hour shifts in a ship infirmary that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, emergency extractions from damaged freighters, triage calls in the dark with power systems failing around them, translating medical instructions across 4 species simultaneously. Sleeping in shifts in bunks that were too small for her, in a corridor that was too narrow for her wingspan, eating food rations that were calibrated for human nutritional needs, and required her to supplement with 3 separate nutrient compounds to compensate for the Velkari difference. She stayed. She kept staying. And Marcus Reyes, by every account I've gathered from people who knew him during that period, was exactly who he looked like. A man who had seen enough of war to no longer find anything glamorous about it. A man who worked with a focused, unhurried competence that people found calming in emergencies. A man who, apparently, talked to the princess the same way he talked to everyone else, without the ceremonial weight, without the reverence, without the careful calibration that everyone else brought to interactions with royalty. He just talked to her. She had apparently found this extraordinary. The thing about the mockery, and there was mockery, a lot of it, I want to be honest about that, is that it didn't come from cruelty exactly. Or not only from cruelty. It came from a very deep, very sincere belief that the princess was making a mistake so enormous it qualified as a kind of tragedy. The Velkari aristocracy's position was clear. A royal bond with a human was not merely unconventional. It was a violation of the Carvel. It was an insult to the lineage. It was, and this is the word that came up again and again in the official statements that began circulating within days of the princess's return, grotesque. Lord Velharan, the senior member of the High Council, gave a public statement that was broadcast on every major Velkari information network. He was careful with his language. He was careful in the way that people are careful when they want to wound without being seen to wound. He spoke of the princess's admirable compassion for lesser species. He spoke of the understandable confusion that could arise from extended isolation in difficult conditions. He spoke, with a gravity that he seemed to find entirely appropriate, of the tragedy of potential unfulfilled. He never used the word human as a pejorative directly. He didn't have to, the context did it for him. The court poets, and yes, the Velkari had court poets, they were a deeply artistic civilization, were less careful. The verses that circulated in the upper caste social networks were sharp and sophisticated and ugly. They compared Marcus to a domestic animal that had been given too much latitude. They made jokes about scale, about the absurdity of a giant lying down with something so small. They wrote elaborate satirical odes about what the offspring of such a pairing might look like. Velyara read all of it. Marcus read all of it too, once she translated it. I know this because later, much later, he told me. He said he'd sat with those translations for a long time. He said he'd wanted to feel angry and found that he mostly felt tired. He said the thing that stayed with him wasn't the cruelty of it, but the certainty, the absolute, unexamined certainty of the people writing those words that they were right. That their sense of proportion, their hierarchy of value, their understanding of what mattered and what didn't, these were not beliefs they held. These were facts they occupied. He said Velyara had taken his hand when he finished reading. She'd said in standard because she'd learned that was the language in which he thought most honestly. They are afraid. People mock what they cannot calibrate. He'd said, That doesn't make it hurt less. She'd said no, but it makes it mean less. The formal court reception was scheduled for 3 days after her arrival. I know what you're thinking. Why was I still there? My freight port job, my expired meal voucher, my original plan. The answer is that I'd run into a Kreth trader at the transit hostel who'd offered me work translating manifest documents from standard to Velkari commercial script, which I could do barely well enough to be useful, and he was paying in transit credits which I needed. So I was staying at a budget hostel near the commercial quarter and doing translation work in the evenings, and wandering the city during the days because Solveth Prime was extraordinary, and I had never been anywhere extraordinary before. The city, the capital, Aura, was built on a scale that made everything feel significant. The architecture was organic in its logic, but precise in its execution. Curves that followed mathematical principles I didn't know the names for. Towers that tapered in graduated stages like arguments building toward a conclusion. Bridges that connected districts in arching sweeps with no visible support structures. There were support structures. They just operated on principles I couldn't see. And the light. The twin suns of Solveth Prime produced a quality of light that I have never found anywhere else. Not brighter than Earth standard, but different in character, richer somehow, like the light itself was more substantial. Everything it touched looked like it was being seen for the first time. I spent those 3 days walking. On the evening before the formal reception, I was in the public plaza near the Grand Court complex when I saw Marcus raise again. He was alone. He was sitting on the edge of one of the plaza's water features, enormous basins fed by natural springs, the water clear enough to see every carved detail of the basin floor 20 feet below the surface. He was sitting with his legs hanging over the edge, which on these basins put his feet about 2 feet above the water, and he was looking at the sky. I hesitated. He was a private person, clearly. The body language said leave me alone without being hostile about it. But I'd been alone for weeks by then, and sometimes loneliness overrides social judgment. I went and sat near him, not right next to him, a few feet of respectful distance, and looked at the same sky he was looking at. After a moment he said, without looking at me, "You're the only other human I've seen since we landed." "I noticed that too," I said. "What are you doing here?" I told him. Translation work, freight connections, running out of options in a specific direction, and this being the next stop. He nodded like that made complete sense to him. "You know who I am," he said. "Yes," I said. Another silence. "Tomorrow's going to be hard," he said, not complaining, just stating a thing. "The reception. There are people on that council," he said, "who have spent the last 2 weeks drafting formal legal challenges to our bond claim, not just objections. Actual legal cases, under the carvel, arguing that the bond is void on the basis of—" He made a gesture that somehow conveyed the word species, without saying it, "on the basis of what I am." What does Velyara say about that? He turned his head and looked at me directly for the first time. His eyes were dark brown, and they had that quality I'd noticed from the concourse. You could read everything that moved through them. "She says they don't understand what I am," he said. "Do you know what that means?" "Not entirely," he said. "I think she does, though." He looked back at the sky. "She told me once," he said, "that when she was young she asked her father, the sovereign, what the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was. And he said the most dangerous thing was a species that had learned to turn pain into purpose. Because most species," Marcus said, "when they hurt they stop, they retreat, they accommodate. But a species that looks at the worst thing that ever happened to it and decides to become something harder." He paused. He was talking about us, about humans. He'd been watching us for decades. He thought we were terrifying. "In a good way," I said. Marcus almost smiled. He didn't specify. He stood up, brushed off his jacket. "You should come tomorrow," he said. To the court reception. Public galleries are open. It might be worth seeing." He walked away before I could respond. I went. Part 2. The Court of the Carvel. The Grand Court of Velsura was the oldest continuously operating governmental chamber in the known galaxy. I'm not exaggerating that for effect. It was a verifiable historical claim, listed in the Galactic Compact's Heritage Register, that the physical chamber had hosted unbroken civic governance for over 4,000 standard years. The original structure had been expanded 17 times, reinforced 8 times, renovated 3 times, and survived 2 planetary sieges and 1 near-orbital bombardment. But the core chamber, the inner sanctum where the sovereign sat and where law was made, had never been replaced, only preserved. Walking into it was like walking into an argument between geology and architecture, and having both sides win. The stone was dark and old, not black but a deep, layered gray that had so many centuries of light and breath absorbed into it that it had started to develop its own quality of depth, the way old books do. The ceiling was so high that I couldn't make out the individual carvings at its peak. The public gallery where I was ushered, with some surprise from the court official who processed my entry, because I was clearly unexpected and clearly human, ran along the upper interior wall, with a railing at waist height, Velkari waist height, which meant it hit me approximately at chest level, and a view down into the main floor that was vertiginous and perfect. The floor below was filling. The Velkari court moved with the specific ritual choreography of a society that had been staging these events for 4,000 years. Everyone knew where to stand. Everyone knew when to bow, what grade of bow, how long to hold it. The court officials moved like currents in a river, purposeful, continuous, never intersecting. The aristocracy arrived in order of rank, which meant the highest ranking arrived last, and the entrance of each new tier was marked by the deepening attentiveness of everyone already present. The High Council arrived as a body, 7 figures in robes of deep indigo, moving with the collective weight of institutional certainty. Lord Velharan was in the center. He was older than most of the others. I could tell because the Velkari bioluminescence dimmed slightly with age, and his had taken on the particular quality of light through clouded glass. But his eyes were sharp. His irises, when he entered and looked at the space around him, were the sharp, clear blue of total focus. He sat at the council table, to the right of the sovereign's dais. And then the sovereign entered. I had read about Sovereign Velkar. The records available to me had described him as aging and traditionalist, and deeply invested in the preservation of the Carvel. The records were accurate but inadequate. He was massive even by Velkari standards, his bioluminescence the deep gold of someone who had been old for a very long time and had stopped being bothered by it. He moved slowly, not with weakness, with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned that speed is a kind of waste. He sat on the sovereign's throne, a chair that was less a piece of furniture than a piece of the floor that had decided to be a different height, and looked at his court with eyes that had been irises amber for longer than anyone in the room had been alive. He looked at his daughter, who entered after him. Veligara walked to her place at his right hand. Marcus Reyes walked with her. He stopped when she stopped. He stood at her side, slightly behind by maybe 6 inches, but beside. The sound in the chamber when he entered, the sound from the council table, from the assembled aristocracy, from the lower galleries, was not a sound anyone made intentionally. It was the sound of a collective in-breath. Lord Velharan's eyes found Marcus immediately. His irises shifted to a cold, specific gray. The formal portion of the reception proceeded in Velkari, which I could follow imperfectly through a translation earpiece I'd borrowed from a sympathetic court aide who had apparently taken pity on my obvious bewilderment. The earpiece ran about 3 seconds behind and had a tendency to render idiom literally, which meant that some of the formal greetings translated as things like, I press my weight against your continuity, and the angle of my eyes acknowledges your age, which I eventually understood were respectful honorifics. The formal business was lengthy and procedural, and I will spare you most of it. What matters is what happened when the procedural portion ended, and Lord Velharan rose. He had, I gathered, been waiting for this moment. The formal business was the door he had to walk through to get to this room. When he stood, the court shifted, not physically, but in attention, in the way that bodies shift when they know something is about to happen. He spoke for a long time. The earpiece translation lagged and garbled, but the shape of what he was saying came through. He spoke of the Carvel. He spoke of its age and its authority. He spoke of the protections it provided, protections of lineage, of cultural integrity, of the sovereign succession. He spoke of the responsibilities of royalty, which were not personal but collective, were not about feeling but about function. He never used Marcus's name. He referred to him when he had to refer to him as the human, just that, the human, the way you'd say the furniture. When he finished, he remained standing, which in Velkari court protocol meant he was presenting a formal challenge for response, not merely making a statement. Veliara stood. She stood very still for a moment, long enough that the silence became a kind of pressure. Then she said something, in Velkari, that my earpiece took a moment to catch up with. When it did, it translated as, "The Lord Velharan speaks of the Carvel as a fence. I speak of it as a foundation." She let that sit. Then she said, "A fence exists to keep things out. A foundation exists to support weight. The Carvel has supported the weight of this house for 4,000 years, not because it kept the galaxy at our borders, but because it defined what our house stood for, what it was built on, what it could not be broken by." She looked at Marcus. "This man," she said, and my earpiece, to its credit, translated man and not human, because she had used the Velkari term that simply meant an adult person of any species, worked alongside me for 16 months in conditions that would have caused many members of this court to request reassignment before the first cycle ended. He made triage decisions under emergency conditions in which the wrong choice meant death, not inconvenience, not political difficulty, but death. He carried the dying. He stayed with them when they went. He carried me once, she said, and her voice changed just slightly, not breaking but deepening, when a structural failure on the Varenthas put me in the path of a support strut collapse. He moved me out of the way. He did not think about it. He did not calculate his risk. He simply moved. A pause. The Carvel says that a bond partner of the royal house must have demonstrated capacity for sacrifice in the face of great cost. Another pause. I have watched him do it for 16 months. I did not need to look further. The chamber was very quiet. Lord Velharan said, with careful coldness, "The Carvel also specifies genetic compatibility, the ability to continue the lineage." "The Carvel," Veliara said, "specifies continuation of the house, not exclusively biological continuation. My great-grandmother, Sovereign Velmara, adopted her bond partner's 3 children from a prior bonding and designated them heirs by formal declaration. The Carvel permitted this. It is in the record." This landed differently than I expected. The aristocracy was still. The council exchanged glances. Lord Velharan's gray irises tightened. "A Velkari adopting Velkari children," he said, "is a categorically different matter than—" "The Carvel does not specify species in that provision," she said. "I have read it. I have read every version of it, including the 2 pre-revised versions that Lord Velharan's own ancestor helped draft. It specifies continuation of house values, capacity for sacrifice, demonstrated loyalty. These are measurable. These have been measured." She said. Marcus hadn't moved through any of this. He was standing slightly behind her, at her right side, and he was looking at the council table with the same contained quality he carried everywhere. Not defiant, not performing defiance, just present, in the way of someone who has decided to be exactly where they are. Lord Velharan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something in Velkari that my earpiece took several seconds to translate. When it did, what it gave me was, "The human is soft. This court will see that in time. These creatures break. It is their nature." He said it quietly, but the chamber was quiet enough that it carried. Marcus heard it. He didn't react, not in his face, not in his posture. He kept looking at the council table, just kept standing there. But something, I couldn't tell you exactly what, something changed in the quality of his stillness. Like a material that had been at rest reaching its load limit and quietly redistributing. I filed that away. That night in the hostel corridor, I ran into one of Veliara's attendants, a young Velkari woman named Velsira, who had taken to acknowledging my existence with slightly more warmth than standard politeness required. I asked her carefully what the outcome of the session had been. "Nothing was resolved," she said, "which is itself a resolution of a kind. The challenge was made. The princess responded. The sovereign," she paused, choosing words, "the sovereign did not intervene." That means... It means he did not stop her. He did not support her either. He sat and he listened. For the sovereign, that is significant in its way. He is a man who has intervened in many things. What does the council do next? They can escalate. Under the Carvel, they can call for a formal voiding tribunal, a hearing specifically on the bond claim. If the tribunal finds against the claim, the princess would be... She stopped. Required to recant. And if she did not recant, the succession implications would be severe. Severe how? She looked at me. She would be removed from succession, and removed from the house formally. She would be, the Velkari word is Velshar. It means unrooted, no longer of the lineage. Would they actually do that? She was quiet for a moment. Lord Velharan, she said finally, is a man who believes that the health of the institution requires the correct enforcement of its principles. He would frame it as mercy, as protecting the house from a choice it could not survive. And the sovereign. Another pause. The sovereign loves his daughter, she said, but he has loved the Carvel for longer. Part 3. What humans carry. The voiding tribunal was called 9 days later. I know this because by then I had, through a combination of circumstances I find difficult to fully explain, become something like a peripheral figure in the small orbit around Marcus and Veliara. Not important, not trusted with anything significant. But there, the only other human in a city of millions, which apparently made me notable enough that, when Marcus needed someone to talk to who would understand his references, I was what was available. We talked in the evenings, mostly. After the formal court obligations, after the sessions with the legal advocates, after the hours of careful diplomatic navigation that had become the texture of every day. He'd come to the plaza sometimes, or we'd find a corner of the hostel's common area, and we'd sit and talk in the easy way that people talk when they don't have to explain their context to each other. He told me things, not secrets, nothing classified, nothing that would compromise Veliara, just observations, impressions. The small accumulation of detail that comes from living in a place long enough to start understanding it. He told me about the Velkari concept of Velthar, which translated as something between dignity and weight, the quality they most valued and most used to evaluate worth. It was not equivalent to pride. It was more like consequence, the sense that a person's existence altered the space around them in ways that mattered. They measure it, he said one evening, not formally, not with instruments, but they calibrate it constantly. When they meet someone, the first thing they're assessing is Velthar. How much weight does this person carry? And humans, I said. He made a complicated face. We confuse them. The way we move, the way we carry ourselves, it doesn't map to their calibration system. We're smaller. Our bioluminescence is non-existent. We don't shift iris color. So the first read is, low Velthar, small creature, low visibility, few signals. And then he paused. And then something happens that reveals what's actually there, and they don't have a category for it. Like what? Like not dying when things get hard, he said simply. Like continuing to function when function is no longer comfortable. Like, he looked for the word, like caring about things that aren't in your immediate survival interest. They don't have a good framework for that. In their experience, that kind of care is a feature of creatures who have high Velthar. And we don't display the right signals for high Velthar. So we confuse their system. Completely, and Lord Velharan, his read of me has been consistent from the beginning. Low Velthar, small, soft, unlikely to last. He's not being intentionally cruel, he's just reporting what his calibration tells him. And when his calibration is wrong. Marcus looked at the plaza water. It will be wrong, he said, and then he'll have to figure out what to do with that. The voiding tribunal was a formal legal proceeding, not a combat or a political session. It was, by Velkari institutional design, supposed to be the most sober, most evidence-based conversation the House could have about a question of the Carvel. It was also, by circumstance, the most exposed. Because the Velkari information networks had been covering the arrival of the princess and her human companion since day one, and public opinion had been complicated, not uniformly against. The Velkari who'd encountered humans in mixed species professional settings were often more measured. Younger Velkari, particularly those who'd done any time on the outer stations or the frontier medical networks, were significantly more likely to have context that complicated the automatic hierarchy. But the institutional weight, the weight of the High Council, the court poets, the traditionalist media networks, the formal structures of Velkari culture, that weight was against them. And it expressed itself, in the days leading up to the tribunal, in ways that were harder than formal legal challenges. There were incidents. A group of young aristocrats, emboldened by the council's position, found Marcus in a public corridor near the diplomatic quarter. They didn't attack him. That would have been a Carvel violation in itself, violence against a guest under formal host status. But they circled him. They spoke to him in Velkari too fast for any translation device to keep up with. They made gestures I didn't know the meaning of but which clearly communicated contempt. They laughed. They were large. They were 7-8 feet each. Marcus was 5'10". He stood there. He looked at them. He didn't move, and he didn't flinch, and he didn't try to leave. He just waited, with that quality of stillness that I had started to recognize as not emptiness but its exact opposite, a container that was full. After a while, the novelty apparently wore off, and they left. When Valsira told me about it later, she said she'd watched from a corridor junction and hadn't been sure what to do. He did not seem afraid, she said, sounding confused by this. He seemed patient. Yes, I said. We don't, she struggled with the thought. Our calibration for creatures under threat, it reads differently than that. A creature with low Velthar, facing a threat, should show either submission or aggression. There are no other categories. He showed neither. He showed, she paused for a long time. He showed that he had decided the situation was not, ultimately, threatening. Is that what he showed? I think so. I have been trying to find another interpretation and I cannot. The tribunal itself lasted 3 days. I wasn't in the chamber for most of it. The public gallery was closed for formal legal proceedings. But I had sources by then. Valsira, a court scribe who had, for reasons I never fully understood, decided I was interesting enough to keep informing. A second attendant who communicated mostly through pointed looks and selective translation of things I should probably know. The legal arguments on Lord Velharan's side were thorough. His advocate, a Velkari legal scholar of apparently impressive reputation, presented a multi-part case under the Carvel that argued 1. That the genetic incompatibility provision, while not species-specific in its literal text, had been universally interpreted for 4,000 years as applying to Valkyrie genetic lines. An interpretive tradition had the force of law under the tribunal's own precedents. 2. That the sacrifice provision that Velyara had cited was contextually inapplicable because the incident in question, the strut collapse on the Varenthes, was a reflex action rather than a deliberate act of sacrifice, and only deliberate sacrifice counted under the Carvel's intent. 3. That the continuity provision Velyara had cited regarding sovereign Velmara's adoption was indeed in the record, but had been followed by a secondary clarifying amendment that narrowed its application. These were not bad arguments. They were careful and well constructed, and they had the weight of institutional precedent behind them. Velyara's advocate responded to each in turn. The exchange was extensive and, by all accounts, extremely close. On the third day, the tribunal was preparing to issue its preliminary finding when two things happened. The first thing was a message, delivered to the tribunal chamber from an external source, which contained testimony from the captain of the Varenthes, the chief medical officer of the Varenthes, and 7 crew members who had been present on the ship during the 16 months of Marcus and Velyara's deployment. The testimony described, in specific detail, 47 separate incidents of what each witness characterized as deliberate sacrifice. Not the strut incident alone, but 47 documented cases where Marcus Reyes had made choices that prioritized the welfare of others over his own comfort, safety, or interest. 47. Someone had been collecting these. Velyara, I assumed, or someone working for her. 16 months of documentation, filed, cross-referenced, ready. The tribunal had to receive it. It was admissible under their own evidentiary rules. They requested a recess to review it. During the recess, the second thing happened. I was in the outer corridor, near the tribunal chamber entrance, when I heard the commotion. Not from inside the chamber, from outside the complex entirely. Noise from the plaza. A crowd gathering in a way that had a specific, sharp quality to it. Not the diffuse electricity of spectators, but the tight, pressurized sound of something actually happening. I moved toward it. Several court officials were moving in the same direction, which told me it was relevant. What I found, in the plaza outside the Grand Court, was this. 3 figures in dark, unmarked armor, not the Royal Guard's formal black, not any military livery I recognized, had cornered Velsira in a narrow archway off the main plaza. She was pressed against the stone wall, and they were large, and they were holding energy restraints that were not a standard piece of civilian equipment. She wasn't being harmed yet, but the restraints made it clear the intention was not conversational. Later investigation established that these 3 individuals were employed by a faction of the traditionalist aristocracy that had concluded the tribunal might not find in their favor, and had decided to apply pressure through alternative means. The plan, as best as anyone could reconstruct it, was to take a royal attendant, create a crisis, and leverage that crisis to force a hasty conclusion to the tribunal proceedings. It was not a sophisticated plan. It also failed, for reasons that began with Marcus Reyes coming around the corner of the plaza 30 seconds after I arrived. He took in the situation in one look. 3 armored figures, approximately Valkyrie height, carrying restraint equipment. 1 frightened attendant pressed against a wall. 20 or 30 bystanders who had stopped and were watching with the frozen attentiveness of people who don't know what they're supposed to do. He crossed the plaza without pausing. The 3 armored figures turned when they heard him coming. They looked at him. He was, again, 5'10". He was wearing his jacket and had no visible weapons. The largest of them said something in Valkyrie that I didn't catch. Marcus said in Standard, "Step away from her." The figure said something again, louder. Marcus said, I'm going to need you to step away from her right now." His voice was the same as it always was, not loud, not aggressive, just present, just filling exactly the space it needed to fill and no more. The three figures exchanged a look. And then the largest one raised the restraint device and pointed it at Marcus, and Marcus moved. I am still not entirely sure what I saw. I know the physics of what happened because I've since talked to people who analyze combat biomechanics, and I've heard their explanation. The summary is, he had been a combat medic in an active conflict zone for 6 years, and combat medics in active zones frequently receive training that goes significantly beyond medical, and he had specifically served in a unit that operated in environments where the enemy was larger, better armed, and numerically superior to his side. And that kind of service produces specific adaptations in how a person responds to a threat differential. What it looked like from where I was standing was this. He moved inside the weapon's arc, fast enough that the figure with the restraint device hadn't finished the targeting motion before Marcus was past it. He did something to the arm holding the device that made the arm stop working the way arms are supposed to work. The device dropped. The figure went sideways, which given its height was a considerable amount of sideways, and hit the plaza floor with a sound that echoed off the stone. The second figure reached for him. He wasn't where they reached. He was, and I can only describe this as he was somehow in 3 places before he was in the 4th one, and the 4th one was the one that mattered, because from there, he applied something to the second figure's center of mass that resulted in that figure joining the first on the plaza floor. The third figure had brought up a different device, a directed energy emitter of some kind, something that looked more serious than the restraints. Marcus stopped. He stopped completely, and he looked at the third figure, and he waited. The third figure held the emitter. The plaza was very quiet. Marcus said, in the same voice as before, "You're going to have to decide whether you're actually going to do that." He wasn't threatening. He wasn't bluffing. He was just offering the person holding the weapon the space to think about their own decision, which was, in retrospect, a remarkable thing to do while standing in front of a directed energy weapon. The third figure held it for another 3 seconds, then lowered it. And then the Royal Guard arrived, about 40 seconds after the fact, which in Marcus's assessment later, and he said this with no particular bitterness, just accuracy, was pretty representative of how often the official protection arrived after the unofficial protection had already handled the situation. Velsira was unharmed. The 3 figures were taken into custody. The plaza crowd, who had watched the entire thing from the bystanders' frozen position, stood for a moment after it was done, and then, gradually, something changed in them. Not immediately applause, not the theatrical response, something quieter, the specific quality of silence that happens when a large group of people have just had a calibration corrected. I saw a Velkari woman in the crowd. She was older, the dimmed bioluminescence of age, gray-white hair pinned back. She was looking at Marcus with her irises shifting. They had been orange, the color of uncertain alarm. As I watched, they shifted, moving through a range of colors I couldn't quite decode, and then settling on something deep and warm. I would later ask Velsira what color that was. She thought for a moment. "It's a color we sometimes call Veltharsoth," she said. "What does that mean?" Roughly, she thought again. Wait acknowledged. It's what we show when we have revised our assessment of someone's significance. Part 4, Blood on the Throne. The tribunal resumed after the incident, with the 3 detained individuals added to the evidentiary record in a way that Lord Velharan visibly found catastrophic. The preliminary finding, issued that afternoon, was narrow and carefully worded. It did not fully endorse Veliara's bond claim under the Carvel, but it declined to void it. It found that the interpretive questions raised were substantive and unresolved, and required further review. This was, in the language of the Carvel, a draw, which meant the bond claim remained standing while additional process played out. Lord Velharan accepted the finding with a stillness that communicated he was already planning the next move. There was going to be a next move. I learned about it from Marcus 2 nights after the tribunal in the plaza. His argument, Marcus said, in the next phase is going to be a formal challenge under the military provision of the Carvel. What's that? There's a provision, one of the older ones, predates about 12 of the Carvel's amendments, that says any disputed bond claim involving a potential consort of the royal house can be resolved by a physical trial. Velkareth, trial of weight, he paused. It's almost never invoked. It's been used twice in recorded history, but it's still in the text and Velharan is going to invoke it, I said. His legal team filed the intent this morning. He looked at the water. The sovereign has to approve the invocation. He hasn't yet. Velyara thinks he won't. But you're not sure. No, I'm not sure. What does the trial involve? A long pause. Combat, he said. Single combat. The disputed party, me, against a champion appointed by the challenging house. If the disputed party wins, the challenge is considered resolved in their favor, and the bond claim is validated under the military provision, which supersedes the genetic provision. And if you lose? He was quiet. Marcus. If I lose, he said, the bond claim is void. And I go home, he paused, if I'm still alive to do it. These things aren't to the death. They're supposed to stop at first blood or incapacitation. He paused. They have a historical tendency to go further than that. I looked at him. What's the champion going to be? Velharan's people get to select, within certain parameters. It has to be a Velkari of full adult development who has passed the warrior class certification. So 8 feet tall, genetically optimized for combat, certified warrior class. More or less. Silence. Are you afraid? I said. He thought about it for a long time. No, he said, and I don't think that's bravery. I think that's I've been afraid enough times that I know what it is. And this isn't it. This is something else. He paused. This is the thing where you've run out of options except the one in front of you. And the one in front of you is the thing you know how to do. The sovereign approved the invocation. Velyara's response to this, according to Velsira, was a period of silence in her chambers lasting 4 hours, after which she emerged and requested a meeting with her father, which lasted another 6 hours, after which she returned to her chambers and did not request anything. She asked to see Marcus the following morning. I don't know what they said to each other. I only know that when Marcus came out of the meeting, he walked to the common area of the diplomatic quarter, sat down, and sat there for a long time. Then he went and found a training space and spent 3 hours in it. I know because I followed him, at a distance, I'm not sure why. The training space was a large chamber equipped with various resistance tools, and at human scale, almost comically undersized for its surroundings. He spent an hour working through movement patterns that I recognized from old videos of Earth defense training, the specific economy of motion that is designed for people who will frequently be outweighed and outreached. Then he spent an hour working with the heaviest resistance settings available on the chamber's equipment, which on Velkari calibration meant settings that were designed to challenge a species roughly twice his muscle mass. He adapted by doing half the repetitions more slowly, and the specificity of that adaptation, knowing exactly what adjustment to make, told me that this was not new to him. Then he sat on the chamber floor and was still for a long time. I left before he came out. The Velkareth was held in the court arena, a formal combat space that was part of the Grand Court complex, used for the warrior certification trials and apparently for this. It was elliptical, the floor a pale stone that had been smoothed by centuries of use. Galleries ringed it on 4 sides. Every seat was filled. I had a gallery seat because Velsira had got me one, and I had not argued. Lord Velharen's champion was named Veldron. He was the current Valkyrie warrior class champion. He had won the certification trials 4 consecutive years, which apparently had not been done in living memory. He was close to 8 feet tall and built along the lines of something that had been engineered rather than grown, not in a technological sense, but in the Valkyrie biological sense, which was that the warrior caste had been selecting for specific physical qualities for a very long time, and Veldron was the current apex of that selection. His bioluminescence was vivid and constant deep blue-green. The color, I had learned enough by then to read the basics of total readiness. He entered the arena, and the crowd responded with a sound that meant what crowds responding to champions always mean. Marcus entered from the opposite side. There was not complete silence for his entrance. Some people in the galleries responded, though I couldn't tell if it was in his support or simply in reaction to him. But relative to the response for Veldron, it was quiet. He walked to the center of the arena. He was wearing training clothes now, not his jacket. He was carrying nothing. He looked at Veldron across the pale stone floor. Veldron looked back at him with the clear blue irises of someone who has fully assessed a situation and found it well within their management. The presiding court official read the terms of the trial. First blood to the face or torso or incapacitation resolves the trial. 3 officials would observe. Any party requesting yield would be heard and the trial stopped. The presiding officer had the authority to stop the trial at any time for safety. He asked both parties if they understood. Veldron indicated yes with a formal gesture. Marcus nodded. The presiding officer stepped back, and the trial began. What happened over the next 19 minutes has been analyzed, discussed, debated, and documented in enough detail that I could probably spend 50 pages on it and not exhaust the record. I'm going to tell you what I saw from where I was sitting, because that's all I actually know. Veldron was fast, faster than his size suggested. The Valkyrie warrior class had a specific neural adaptation that shortened reaction time, and in Veldron it was at its most developed. He moved across the arena floor with a fluid power that was, honestly, beautiful to watch. Marcus did not try to match that speed. He moved differently. He moved in the specific, infuriating, effective way that people move when they have learned to operate in a space defined by someone else's advantage. He wasn't trying to cover the same ground as Veldron. He was trying to be somewhere that Veldron's movement left open. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes he didn't. At 4 minutes, Veldron caught him across the shoulder with a sweep that sent him into the arena wall. The crowd sound was enormous. Marcus got up. He was slower getting up than he'd been at the start. He oriented himself. He moved back toward center. At 7 minutes, Marcus got inside Veldron's reach and applied something to the warrior's arm that made Veldron grunt. I actually heard it from the gallery and pull back. Not injured significantly, but disrupted. Recalibrating. For about 30 seconds, Veldron was visibly reassessing. In those 30 seconds, Marcus's breathing was visible from the gallery. Ragged. He was hurting from the wall impact. He was moving more carefully, protecting his left side. At 9 minutes, Veldron went for the left side. Marcus wasn't there. He'd anticipated it or gambled on it. Either way, he wasn't there, and from where he actually was, he did something fast and precise to Veldron's knee joint, not breaking it, not injuring it significantly, but disrupting the mechanical function for about 3 seconds, which is a long time in a fight. He didn't capitalize on those 3 seconds the way the crowd expected. He moved back instead, created distance. I watched Velharen from across the arena. His irises were the sharp gray of absolute focus. He was watching Marcus with an expression I couldn't fully decode, but it was different from the cold contempt of the first day. It was something else was in there now. At 12 minutes, Veldron landed a blow that was, honestly, it looked like it should have ended the trial. I heard the impact sound from the gallery. Marcus went down to one knee. He stayed there for a moment that felt longer than it was. The gallery was very loud. Then he got up. Veldron watched him get up. And I watched it happen in real time, and I've thought about it many times since, and I still think I'm reading it correctly. Something in Veldron's posture changed. A recalibration. Not of tactics, not of approach, of something more fundamental. He had hit this human with something that his experience told him ended things. The human had gotten up. At 17 minutes, they were both significantly compromised. Veldron had taken 2 more disruptions to his movement that he hadn't fully recovered from. Marcus was moving with his left arm down, protecting a rib or ribs that were probably broken, and there was blood on his face from a cut above his eye that I couldn't see clearly, but that the gallery could see on the larger screens above the arena. Blood on his face counted as first blood to the face, under the trial terms. The presiding official was watching. He could have stopped it. He had the authority. He was watching Marcus's face, and he was watching Marcus, and I think he was doing the same calculation the rest of us were, which was, how much of this is still the trial and how much is something else now? He didn't stop it. Because Marcus hadn't asked him to, and neither had Veldron. At 19 minutes, they were in the center of the arena, and Veldron moved for what I think was intended as a finishing sequence. A set of moves that his warrior-class training had optimized for exactly this situation, built on everything he'd learned about Marcus's movement patterns over the previous 18 minutes. And Marcus, who had been letting Veldron build that understanding for 18 minutes, did something entirely different. Not different in a dramatic, theatrical way. Different in the specific way of someone who has been presenting version A of themselves with the express purpose of generating the reaction that makes version B possible. He had been losing strategically in order to win. I don't know if that's what he was doing. I still don't know for certain. But I've talked to enough combat specialists since, and they've reviewed the arena footage, and the consensus among the ones who study this is, yes, he had been shaping the encounter, not to survive it, to conclude it. Veldron's finishing sequence met something that wasn't where the sequence expected it to be, and in the gap between expectation and reality, Marcus found the position he'd needed, and applied to Veldron's central mass a force that used Veldron's own considerable momentum as its primary engine, and Veldron went down. He went down hard. He did not immediately get up. The arena was silent. Veldron lay on the pale stone floor for 4 seconds. Then he moved, turned over, pushed himself partially up. He was not incapacitated, but he was down. Marcus was standing above him. He was breathing hard. His face was bleeding. He was holding his left side. He looked like exactly what he was, which was a man who had just spent 19 minutes getting hit by something much larger and harder than him, and was still standing. He looked down at Veldron, and then he offered him his hand. Not performatively, not for the crowd. He offered it the way you offer someone your hand when they've fallen and you're the nearest person standing, the simple, automatic gesture of someone whose reflex, at the end of a fight, is not to stand over the fallen but to help them up. The arena was so quiet I could hear my own breathing from the gallery. Veldron looked at the hand for a long moment. Then he took it. Marcus pulled him to his feet. Both of them were unsteady, but they were upright. The arena held that silence for another 3 seconds. And then it broke. The sound from the Valkyrie galleries was not what I expected. I had been expecting anger, or shock, or the grudging response of a crowd that has witnessed something it didn't want to witness. It was not that. It was the sound of a very large group of people revising something, which has its own distinct quality, not quite celebration, not quite acknowledgement, but something in between that carries weight. I looked at Velharen. His irises had changed. They had shifted to the color I'd seen on the older woman in the plaza. Veltharsath, Wade acknowledged. He sat very still at the council table. He was looking at Marcus, standing in the center of the arena with his arm around Veldron's shoulder, because both of them needed the support. He sat there with that color in his eyes, and the expression of a man who has found that the foundation of a belief he has held for a very long time has turned out to be something other than what he'd been told. From the sovereign's throne, which had been positioned at the arena's head for the formal proceeding, Velkar rose. The sovereign did not speak often in public settings. He governed, but he governed through the court apparatus, through the Carvel, through his council and his officials. His personal interventions were rare. He walked down from the dais. He crossed the arena floor. He stopped in front of Marcus. He looked at him for a long time. Marcus looked back. He did not look up. They were the wrong proportions for looking up. The sovereign was a head and a half taller. He looked directly at the sovereign's level in the way that is either incredible lack of deference or completely secure self-knowledge, and which read in this case as the latter. The sovereign said something in Velkari. My earpiece was in my ear. It translated after a moment. You carry more than you look like you carry. Marcus said, I've been told that. The sovereign made a sound low from the chest that I took a moment to recognize as laughter. He turned back toward his throne. As he passed Velyara, who was standing at the arena's edge, her irises the deepest gold I'd seen, her bioluminescence so active it was throwing light onto the pale stone around her, he stopped. He said something to her that my earpiece didn't catch clearly. A partial translation came through, something about foundations, something about weight, something about having been wrong about where weight could come from. She took his hand. His irises, for just a moment, shifted from amber toward that deep, warm gold.